we'll get underway, and I'll explain what we're going to do as we let some more people file in. This is a 2-hour session. In the first half hour, there will be 3 of us. TOSIN and SONALI will be joining, and they should be on your screen right now. At the half-hour mark, we'll be joined by Adam FOSS and MILGRAM, and then SONALI will swap out after an hour. And so you should think of this conversation as trending from venture capital to what's going on in criminal justice and the future of policing. But there are a lot of overlaps along the way, and hopefully also some current events. And so we'll get started now. So welcome again. This is Ed Zimmerman from Lowenstein Sandler, and we're delighted to have you joining us for our VentureCrush event. And I would love to have a conversation first with TOSIN at Octopus, and then SONALI at Accel, and then we'll be joined a little later by my colleague Ann Milgram, and also by Adam FOSS. So starting with TOSIN, your background, I'd like to get a little bit of background on both you and SONALI. Your background is kind of extraordinary in the amount of terrain in terms of subject matter and geography that you've covered. And if you could give us just a little thumbnail sketch of your background, because it also kind of informs a bit about your perspective on the world.
Of course. So I guess my background personally, as you rightly pointed out, has crossed a number of continents. So I was born in Nigeria and lived in Nigeria until I was 12 years old. Moved to the US, spent my middle school, high school years, college years here. Shortly thereafter, moved to Europe and spent a healthy amount of time in Europe working on immigration policy issues, economic policy issues there, particularly within the EU and sort of in bordering industries, I guess is a good way of putting it. And then also spent time thereafter focused on sort of Africa in 2 parts. One was venture capital based in South Africa. And then I also spent time working on electricity infrastructure. So how to finance, how to grow electricity infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa. And then I went back, I guess one could say, to the venture capital interest that had sort of incepted in South Africa at a really, really dynamic organization. And I'm happy to talk more about it. It's called the Avito project. And that eventually led me to Octopus Ventures. And once upon a time, I should also say this. So once upon a time, I studied English literature. I studied music in college. I thought I was going to become an English PhD. Then I went to law school. I thought I was going to become a lawyer. And finance captured me in part because I saw it as a vehicle for catalyzing economic development and international development in a number of ways. And so that also took me across those different geographies.
And you're kind of a policy geek as well, no?
I guess it's cool to be a geek nowadays, so I own that term. But once upon a time, I used to really enjoy thinking critically about sort of policy. As I said, migration policy was one of the first places I started, and it started from an interest in post-colonial literature, actually. And from there, I started to think about sort of the other implications, the policy implications on sort of the migration experience, the migrants' experience, so to speak, and economic policy, general social policy, et cetera, started to feed into that.
And so when you talked about studying policy, you are a Fulbright scholar, and you did your Fulbright in Brussels and in Greece, and that seems to have informed your thesis on fintech investing. And you talked about having gone to law school. You went to Yale Law School, which has been somewhat controversial, and has also been a place that has educated a lot of people who are leading voices on the right, and some certainly on the left. You also are now a VC, which was not a straight line from your Texas Civil Rights Project law clerkship that you did. And so what what kinds of companies excite you, just so that we have a sense of your investment thesis? And it's not a surprise that you're a VC of a UK-based, UK and US-based firm, but there's more emphasis on UK, and you're here in New York. So part of your complicated life, right?
Yeah. So you you both challenged and criticized so much of my background, which is amazing, because that's the lens that's the lens with which I view many of the things I've done and do, right? This is a conversation me and Ed have all the time, right? Yeah, so what do I care about? How have these disparate experiences influenced what I care about in fintech? And so I guess the policy and legal aspect of my background biases me towards regulated industries, because I'm acutely aware of the fact that in regulated industries, there is an explicit sense that the public interest has to be represented. And in many cases, the government is representing the public interest in a way that is in some cases antithetical to the private interest. And so that conversation between the public and private is something, just based on my background, I'm interested in. Now, Texas Civil Rights Project alludes to a strong sort of social justice focused, public interest focused legal orientation I had. So the immigration work that I did prior to law school then led to a lot of immigration work during law school. And so as I think critically about the kinds of investments that I care about, I always have a question, like a gating question that starts, when I look at a company, which is what are the externalities that arise from this solution becoming, status quo, growing exponentially and becoming a thing? Is it actually going to have a net positive or net negative impact on society? And it sounds like a super generalized question, but honestly, I don't think enough people are asking those questions when they're looking to finance companies. I think we are, in our industry, understandably, motivated by the returns. And in many cases, we don't have to ask those questions and still be able to get those returns and check the box of a lot of stakeholders. So without even needing to be a social impact oriented VC, one can still think critically about the bottom line for the public, in addition to the bottom line for the stakeholders we engage with regularly.
And I want to use this as a transition to SONALI, because I know that there is this concept that both of you seem to care about, which is purposeful investing. I'm not saying that you're impact investors, but there's something about purpose and intent. And you and I, SONALI, can have a conversation that doesn't usually happen in the venture capital world, because we can talk about our shared experience on the blue bus. And so maybe as you introduce yourself, you can talk a little bit about how you ended up on the blue bus, which I'm sure nobody on this call but the two of us would know.
No, and it sounds a lot more ominous than it really was. So I'll explain. First, thanks, Ed, for having me here. It's been many years that I wanted to make the trip to New York, and I think sometimes lockdown has helped to make these things happen. I have a history and story that's a lot more straight line than TOSIN. So I'm reeling from being impressed with that sort of diverse background. So born and raised in Bombay, I still call it that, as many Bombayites do, India. And I think I realized at the age of 8 that since we didn't have any sort of family business in the context here, that India was very much still a socialist country. So there were very few sort of private sector opportunities. It was really dominated by public sector spend and the government. And so I remember having this sort of this very clarifying discussion with my mother, and I kind of always knew that my options in life would be a doctor, and I knew I would never be able to hack it, just in so many different ways. Be an accountant, that sounded so dire, or figure something else out. So at a very young age, and I think it indeed is very young, and I tell my kids, at your age I was doing this and they don't appreciate it, I figured out I better kind of get out of the country if I could. So from an early age, I sort of started making plans on my own, and I unfortunately didn't have the means and the resources to do so. So I applied to every college that I'd heard of, and through some very primary bookshelf research, so physical books, sitting there, copying, addresses, etc., printing out forms without access to any of the printers. Anyway, I got myself to Bryn Mawr College, which is the sister college of Haverford College. I was pretty shocked to be, so far from a city of 26 million people to be in suburban America. And I found myself on the blue bus all the time, because the blue bus is what shuttled you from Bryn Mawr and Haverford back and forth, because it was a shared curriculum. So thank you for bringing it up, Ed. It's been a long time since I saw a blue bus. Anyway, I'll go faster now. As someone who knew they would need an H-1B visa and had to pay off a lot of student loans, because Bryn Mawr had been kind enough to give me a full sort of scholarship and more, I entered the dark world of investment banking. I don't know what I would have done if I had more choices and didn't have sort of visa and student loans. I'd like to think I could have been more multidimensional in what I chose, but it was a thing to do back then. And it was in the mid-90s. It was not 95 when Netscape went public, and that was it. I was hooked on tech. The founders that we met, the stories that I heard, the pace at which these companies were growing, they were so strategically interesting. And I've never looked back since. I finished off my CV collection, as they say, just to make sure that there was, I wouldn't look back and make mistakes, since I had started the journey. So I went to Harvard Business School, did that, got it out of the way. Again, not sure, whether that was all the right thing, and got a job in venture capital in Europe. And why Europe? If you were in Europe in '99, it sort of looks and feels the way it looked in 2009. I was 10 years too early. I had no idea. I think the early years of being venture capital in Europe were a little bit like sort of watching paint dry, but it taught me everything I know. And it's what I've been doing since the beginning.
That's a great background. And with Bryn Mawr, and then I promise we'll leave Bryn Mawr and Haverford. And I also had culture shock when I got to Haverford, and it took a while. But with Bryn Mawr, my understanding is that you applied to just over 36 colleges and told each that you could only go if it was free. And
Yes.
Bryn Mawr answered the call.
Yes, it was exactly like that. I was unable to pay anything. So it was sort of kind of going there begging, which is why I thought I'll just ask every college there is out there. I think I applied to some schools that literally no one's heard of, or at least I've not heard of.
And you were quoted in the Wall Street Journal talking about Swedish companies, and this is at a time when Berlin had been ranked 15th by a survey where they talked about like the leading tech hotspots in the world. So Berlin comes in 15th, London is ahead of Berlin, but not by a ton. And Stockholm and the Nordics don't make the list. And you are quoted in the Wall Street Journal as saying, all sorts of great things about Sweden. You're not Swedish. I don't know how much time you had spent in Sweden. And I'll mention that this was 2012. So do you get tired of being too early, or were you not too early there?
It's a great question. Look, Sweden had this perfect combination of being incredibly international in terms of outlook and the education system. And I don't know if you know the history, but it was very early in terms of internet penetration, which is why piracy was so rampant there. And that's what sort of started some of the movement around Spotify. So I don't think it was bleeding early, but it was not obvious at all. And I think we had probably made 2 investments already by then in Sweden and a third to follow. And, for luck or some good picking, they were all successful. And so it had this sort of, it's a local small country where you could experiment. People were very open-minded. The government had done a lot in terms of even giving people laptops and really promoting cheap broadband, which meant everybody was online. So you had this sort of petri dish where you could try out different services. But because it was not big enough, unlike the UK and Germany, the entire outlook for the Swedish entrepreneurs was, how do I get to the States, or how do I get to build a global company? You saw this in Israel too, of course, in terms of the evolution of technology. It's been that story for 20 plus years, and it's done incredibly well. But I would say in the European landscape, Sweden was an early riser, if you will, and it really played these 2 aspects to the problem they were solving incredibly well. And which is why, there's history that shows that if you look at the top companies that have emerged from Europe, Sweden has contributed far more versus sort of, the percentage of GDP. Things are changing now, but it's been pretty incredible to see the rise there.
And TOSIN, it's curious to me that Sonali, leaves HBS and goes to an unlikely geography, and then is infatuated way before most VCs, especially most VCs who aren't Swedish or at least Nordic, with this Nordic geography. And you come out of this extraordinary background, super education credentials, and decide that you're going to be in a Europe-focused, UK-centric fund. Was that a deep belief in a geography and a follow-on of your studies and your time there? Are you still bullish on Europe?
Yeah, it's a couple of things. One, it's this sense of, I guess, geographic arbitrage that could be made. It's also sort of based on a personal affinity. So to the first point, right, what I mean by that is that there are a number of learnings that can be taken across the pond to the other location, and in so doing allow you to be able to understand trends to come, or ways in which technology developments can exist in a different market that is somewhat similar but somewhat different, right? And that's part of the work that Octopus has spent a healthy amount of time. Octopus Ventures being the VC firm that I'm a part of, is spending a lot of time doing has been thinking critically about how, for example, in the fintech landscape, massive explosions in challenger banks and banking as a service or payments as a service applications have already thrived in the European context and stand to perhaps an American context. What are the differences? What are the similarities, right? So being able to have this sort of 2 feet or feet in each of these different contexts means that you can carry learnings to the next context and perhaps invest in great companies before they even sprout in a new context, because you have learnings from, for example, Europe, or in the other direction, right? I've learned a healthy amount about the American landscape in ways that are just beginning to come to play in like the UK space. Personal affinity wise, as you pointed out, like my background has allowed me to be in Europe quite some time. I also am married to a German, as you know. And so there's also a personal element of like loving and being connected to and better understanding the European space, and also developing a certain amount of cultural competency that allows me then to be able to literally and figuratively speak the language in both geographies. And so that's sort of been helpful at the start, and was helpful in making the decision at the onset, and helpful also in growing and thriving in this space. And there are challenges. Like I kid you not. I mean, literally I work in the UK and I work in the US, and I assume because of the language similarities that things are just fine and dandy, but there's still a ton of cultural competencies that I still have to develop on another side of the Atlantic that I think I have, but I actually don't have. So it's still a work in progress. I haven't arrived by any means in being able to perfectly execute on both ends.
And the cultural competence is something that I think also we're seeing intra-America right now. And there are a number of things that we'll talk about a little later as well that are more around some of the tone deafness that we're seeing from leaders and others, which we'll also talk about. So we did a survey before the event, and I appreciate the dozens of people who were kind enough to not only fill out every box in the survey, but to also give us great questions and topics and feedback. And that's really valuable to us. And there were 2 topics that I want to cover that people really wanted to hear about. And I will give the caveat that Sonali and TOSIN are not in the business of being professional limited partners investing into venture funds. They invest out of venture funds and manage those investments. But people really wanted to know about the fundraising climate for VCs. So going back in the supply chain to the money that enters the venture system. And there was a question around whether the second half of this year and next year will be a relatively robust period in which people can raise an additional venture fund, or people who are raising a first-time fund will get to closure. And so I'd love to hear maybe from Sonali first and then TOSIN, how you're thinking about the dynamics of raising a new fund.
Yeah, I mean, the caveat is, you know, we're lucky enough that we're in our 38th year, so when we're not new, 20 years in Europe. That said, we have spent a lot of time with our limited partners over, as you can imagine, during COVID, sort of updating them and getting their perspective on what's happening. And I can definitely, at a high level, share some of what we're seeing, and it probably won't be a surprise. There's just a general trend both on the IPO market, on the venture market, and of course on the LP market too, given the sort of, you know, the environment in which we are and the uncertainty and the volatility. And what we've heard is that there were quite a few managers who came back to the market the first quarter of this year. So people were pretty active, very busy. Our understanding is that there were and there are managers who that are the existing managers who thought, you know what, since I was planning to come back anyway, I'll make it happen sooner just because of the environment, because you don't know whether, you know, it'll be a good market or maybe it just makes sense to sort of shore up. So what we've heard is that the LPs have been incredibly busy. And just to give you a sense, our LPs are pension funds, endowments, fund of funds, et cetera. They've been very, very busy kind of the first half of this year. And generally, our sense is that unless it's sort of a super interesting new spin out opportunity, it's unlikely that there's going to be a lot of interest or time for first time funds, given how busy they've been, I guess how much of the capital has been invested. And remember, for a lot of these funds, they have budgets. And they sort of look at their budgets at the start of the year. And at the end of the day, I don't think there's a concept of slush budgets. They're very picky and they really do their work. So it's not like they're not open to it, but if they've got the managers they want and it's a uncertain environment and they've sort of been through their budgets, I think they'll probably be a lot more open the first half of next year and building a relationship in the run up to that. So that would be my takeaway and my insight from the discussions that I'm having. Again, it's not a no, but generally what I'm hearing is that they're pretty busy for this year.
So for first-time funds or second-time funds, perhaps a dimmer view of the next 6, maybe 12 months, and for existing funds that are raising Fund 3 or raising Fund 4, does that dimness continue for them as well?
So Ed, what I would say is I think whether you're on the budget or not matters a lot to these investors. So if they knew you were coming, they would probably have you as a line item and you would kind of know whether they want to kind of tee up or not, frankly, whether they want to step back or up. So I think if you're in the budget, it's probably an okay time. And what I would say in general, people are not as worried about the venture side. There's a lot, you know, these are large endowments and money managers, and they have a lot of exposure to A, the public markets, B, the old economy, the leverage markets too. So venture is very small in the grand scheme of things. I mean, we're here on VentureCrush, so I assume it's related to venture funds. And so I think this is not where their worry or their focus is. So again, there's always an opportunity, but I think timing matters.
TOSIN, you want to add?
Yeah, much of what Sonali said, I agree with. One thing I would just add in addition to that is when you are, I mean, if you are going out for existing, as an existing, you know, GP going to an LP, and you have the questions as to whether or not, I mean, LPs are, one, able to or willing to. On the able to point, in some situations, they are, you know, they have invested in you over a period of time and they're just, their mandate is to be tapped out at a certain point. And so in some ways you will effectively return to becoming a new investor and will have to sort of position yourself in front of new LPs or the existing LPs as a sort of a new GP. And so the points that Sonali made about sort of new GPs and new, you know, investing in new funds would apply probably even if you still had existing relationships at present. One thing also that we see a little bit when going to LPs now is I guess it's almost a warning, so to speak. Be careful who the LP is and what their expectations are with respect to what venture growth or what a venture investment growth should look like. Some LPs are increasingly moving towards looking at PE-esque profiles of companies. the profiles that they believe like a latter, stage, a growth stage, for example, investment should be had. And one of the challenges is if you start, because there's a significant amount of capital oftentimes that comes in early into companies, there can be this gap between the sort of venture seed to B amount deployed, and then your pure play growth type company. That is perhaps EBITDA positive, that you're just injecting cash to sort of like run and grow and scale. There might be a gap between those two different stages where your run-of-the-mill LP that thinks, she or he would be investing in your pure play PES company gets uncomfortable. And if you go back with the profiles of companies or return profiles of companies that are sitting within that gap, and you say, okay, we'd love to raise a subsequent fund, you might get far more scrutiny than you expected. And now in this day and age where we see the WeWorks of this world and all that precipitating an increased call for a path to profitability, there also might be an increased call for profitability from the eyes of your LP as they scrutinize the companies in your portfolio.
So I want to latch onto that path to profitability. I've got a question for Sonali, and then I'm hoping that Anne and Adam will join us. And the question is, in light of the more risk-averse approach that both Sonali and TOSIN have underscored from those who invest into venture funds. Sonali, you were quoted in the FT a couple of months ago about an investment that Accel had made, and you talked about creating a new category, a new kind of behavior. So as people are pushing for maybe profitability and maybe a little less risk, isn't it really, really risky to bet, particularly today in 2020, that the world will adopt these new big bang markets and that the world will change behavior?
So I think we've all seen and experienced a ton of change over the last 3 months, and I think we all acknowledge the very difficult times that we live in. In many ways, tech has been the backbone of the economy. It's allowed us to do remote work from home, collaboration, see our loved ones. And what we've seen is a very dramatic acceleration of the number of trends, whether on the enterprise side, companies that enable security that allow you to do that, companies on the health side and telehealth, because now it's actually the right thing to do, which is to see your primary care physician online versus going physically and taking the risk. On the financial services side in terms of payments, et cetera, and then a whole bunch of other sectors that I haven't talked about, like education. On top of that, because of that behavior, there are new categories that are being created in terms of this is how it was done today, this is how it could be done. So we probably have never been busier, all on Zoom, and we have not missed a beat in terms of being active. We're taking as much risk. You can ask, how are you making investment decisions on Zoom? That's not obvious, but we are. So we made new deals with companies we've only met on Zoom. So no, I would actually tell you that I don't think we're taking more risk. I think if anything, tech has accelerated a number of really interesting trends that were well underway, but are going much faster. Even if that means backing new categories, I think we're seeing valuations as well as volume sort of stay right up there. And so yeah, I would say business is really open in a big way, in fact.
Okay, so and Anne and Adam, if you're able to turn on your video now and join us at the point at which Sonali had said business is open. Great. Okay, so I want to welcome former Attorney General of New Jersey Anne MILGRAM and former prosecutor Adam FOSS. And it's interesting because given that you both have that law enforcement title in your background and the conversation around law enforcement and the professionals who enter it, people might draw some inferences from that. And I know we're going to do a deeper dive into your respective backgrounds, but Adam, I was riveted in 2016 when I was sitting probably 40 feet from you with tears in my eyes watching your very moving TED Talk that I know millions of people have seen, and was delighted to find out that you have this lovely relationship that stretches way back with Anne. Can you tell us a little bit about your background as well?
Ed, thank you for inviting me here. It's very nice to meet the folks on the call that I don't know, to all the people that I cannot see, you obviously, and my good friend Anne. My name is Adam Foss. I was a prosecutor in Boston for about 10 years, and during that period of time got to see the front lines of the buildup of mass incarceration, and really when it entered the lexicon of sort of households because of the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Had no intention of being in the criminal justice system as a lawyer, had really no intention of being a lawyer. Went to college to be a doctor because I grew up in a community where no one that I knew went to college. And as a result, I thought, to get myself out of here, I need to become a doctor. That environment that I grew up in, that neighborhood I grew up in, was a defunct mill town just outside of Boston. That is, in retrospect, a place where a lot of these issues around racism and police accountability were bubbling under the surface, and I didn't know until I started reflecting on all those things now. I was adopted by two lovely people from that town. My parents, who raised me, were white Republicans, and that is how I was brought up. That's how I learned. That's how I was conditioned. And so to be doing the work that I do now with that kind of background has been really interesting, and has provided me a lot of opportunity to speak to lots of people about what's going on, and I'm happy to do so here.
No, you went, and I know we talked about this a little bit before. So because you went right to the adoption, I want to just share something from your Instagram post from Mother's Day, if that's okay. And
I'd love that.
I am not good with Instagram. It's not where I feel kind of native, and yet I am perfectly comfortable spewing unfiltered thoughts on Twitter. But you use Instagram in a really fascinating way, and I really encourage people to get in and read those marvelous essays. But on Mother's Day, you wrote, "Today I'm reminded of the blessing that was my mother. I remember this moment standing in the adoption agency, about to take home the squirmy, drooling glowworm in a bonnet. I was too young to realize, but even today, two things about this moment are beyond comprehension. One, the glowworm would become a beautiful and strong mother of her own brown child. And two, my mother chose us, and in doing so, opened doors that we never would have access to had she not." And it seems like you've spent your professional life opening those doors, which is not the role you think of a prosecutor playing. Why? And how did you come up with that pathway?
Yeah, I think I want to push back a little bit on that not being the role of the prosecutor, because what we know by opening those doors, or at least preventing their closing, gives us access to things that actually keep us safe. We, for a long time, have relied on the enforcement of laws, police and prisons and prosecutors to mete out safety in our communities. But if you asked a room full of people what keeps you safe, those words almost would never come up for them. Safety is a stable house, a stable housing situation, nutritious food, access to employment, access to transportation, access to pro-social activity for kids, access to education. And as prosecutors, we have the opportunity to either open more doors for people who come into our system, both as survivors of crime and as offenders of crime. But we also have an extreme amount of power to remove barriers, or to stop barriers from closing on them. And so lots of convictions lead to the inaccess to all of those things that keep us safe. So in my mind, it's in the best interest of prosecutors to keep that in mind all the time as they're doing their job.
Okay, and I'm going to ask Anne to also comment on that. That's a great perspective. And just to give a very quick tee up, Anne has been a friend for many years, but is also a colleague here at Lowenstein Sandler. And we're going to talk just after this about leadership. And I know Sonali has written a lot about leadership and spent a lot of time on it. And Anne led a team of more than 40,000 people across states, lawyers, state and local police, investigators, and public safety officials. And she was the 57th Attorney General, actually succeeding our Lowenstein Sandler partner and someone who was a mentor to me, Zulema Farber, who was not only the AG, but was also the first Afro-Cuban woman to serve briefly as acting governor of New Jersey, as the AG does from time to time, and as Anne has. You were also an ADA, and you were the Department of Justice's top law enforcement official as to human trafficking. Do prosecutors, do you think people think of prosecutors as opening doors for folks?
So, you know, look, I think this is a great conversation to have, in part because I don't think enough people think about prosecutors as part of the public safety community and sort of being invested in the public safety community. And that's in part because the system doesn't work in a lot of places like I would like to see it work, and I think like Adam would like to see it work. And it's in part because of just the way American criminal justice has run. And I think, you know, there's no doubt in my mind that there is systemic racism and bias in that system. And there's also, frankly, a lot of other problems on top of that. And so the piping is broken. And so I think what Adam said to me is in some ways the most important thing, which is that I was a prosecutor for many years. When I became AG, I was the chief law enforcement officer in the state, and I got this different vantage point over what was happening. And it completely changed the way I looked at problems. As a line prosecutor, you see an individual case, a piece of paper that comes into your office. It comes from a police officer who's made a value judgment about what constitutes crime and what should be prosecuted as crime. And so I really had looked very closely at the cases in front of me. Then I became AG, I got this oversight view. And at the same time, a prior AG had taken over the Camden, New Jersey Police Department. And this has been a topic of conversation a lot in the United States. We went essentially from being the most dangerous city in America the day I started to, I think, I would argue, one of the best models for policing reform in our country. It's not perfect, but it is a million times better than a lot of what we see. And it was really hard. It is, to this date, the hardest thing I've ever done. But what came out of that is where Adam sort of started, which is that crime is not about, like, public safety is not just crime, right? And it is about so many things that are so much more complicated. And if we as a society just wait until a crime is committed, we are essentially seeding our communities, right? Versus looking at upstream, how we deal with housing and education and all these other things, the social determinants of health, the social determinants of crime, adverse child experiences. There are so many ways in which we can have dramatically more safety, more equity, and more fairness in communities. And to me, it's like we've done this very lazy thing of waiting until the crime happens to react as a society and putting all of our resources and time into this downstream reaction. And it's a loop where that's all we do. And so I personally think that where Adam sort of starts is where we need to be moving these systems. So we're not just waiting for something bad to happen and react. And basically we have to figure out how to make communities safer in a preventative way, which is what we've done in Camden and a couple of other places have done. But it is very much a mind shift and a system shift that I would even argue, we can talk about this later, a lot of the reform conversation is focused way too much on this reactive policing, like, response. Yes, we should fix use of force policies. Yes, we should fix training. That will not change the problems that we have in our system today. We have to do this other piece too.
Great. And what's kind of interesting is how much you sound like the visionary founder of a tech company. And I know that both you and Adam spend lots of time talking to CEOs of large publicly traded tech companies. Sonali, you've written a lot about leadership, and you've talked about, in 2018, you talked about the top 3 qualities of every great leader. And one of the 3 was the importance of focus. And when Anne says, it completely changed the way I looked at the problem and the mind shift. How does that click with how you think about founders approaching problems that other people are not solving the same way or not seeing the same way?
Yeah, it's a great question. It really is one of the key attributes that sort of make us sit up and listen when we meet great founders. I mean, we all know founders need to be incredibly good storytellers because they need to fundraise. They need to have a knack for both spotting as well as hiring talent. So it's a lot about the charisma. It's a lot about that vision, but really underlying it all is this ability to sort of see a problem, see a multidimensional problem in a very different way. We like to call it sort of seeing around corners, of founders who see the future first. And, the way I sort of kind of picture it in my mind is that we all have the dots staring at us, but the founders who seem to figure it out earlier, they join the dots in a totally different way. And they do it just because their mind is seeing something that is orthogonally different. It's sort of, why will it work as opposed to why it won't work? And that defines their vision of the future. And that's what's really magnetic. And, it's people talk a lot about how it's about the ideas and about the people. There's a lot of lip service to that because, of course, everybody looks at, especially the later stage of the numbers, etc. But the truth is, when you have that aha moment with that founder who still has the ability to hire great people and everything else I talked about, and the kind of the vision or the joining the dots, so the seeing the future first, it's almost electrifying.
And I want to go to TOSIN in a minute on the access point that Adam talked about, but you just said, and the ability to hire great people. So it's like, I have to look at all of this data and I have to solve a problem differently than pretty much anyone else is solving it, and maybe see it differently than anyone else is looking at it. But then I also have to hire great people and build a culture. And in one of the interviews that you did with one of your founders, the founder of Avito, he talked about how much time he spent hiring the first 20 people in the company, but that was incredibly crucial. And there's also a discussion about deciding to pay people after the Crimean War. And you had all of these employees who were now in Ukraine and what that meant. How do you think about, okay, great problem solver, and by the way, this person could be an HR professional? Is that like a dual role?
Yeah. So no, most founders are not born great at hiring. They're not born at sort of, and definitely not the core HR professional, but there's two things. One is the ability to kind of identify that somebody is really talented, and that just takes time, but there's also, just a bit of kind of gut there. And the other one is the ability to actually attract them. And that do not take for granted, right? Some of the best teams we've seen, if you look at the sort of the top lineup of the teams, if you look at the kind of the CCO, the CRO, whatever you want to call it, the COO, each of those people could be actually founding their own startup, or they could be CEO of their own startup, but they've actually joined this particular founder because they found that vision so attractive. So that sort of magnetic ability to hire people who actually should be impossible given the compensation and the stage of the company, that is a big aspect of it. Is it all proven when we invest? Not at all, because some of these companies are at seed stage or at Series A stage. So there are other ways that we have to sort of think about it. I mean, the culture point, this is, of course, we could talk on forever, and I think it's probably more relevant now given the market and the time and the sort of, the world around us. But we think of it simply, you can create shareholder value, but you can still have a very strong set of core values. And the question is, can the two go together? And are you building the company such that you're not compromising one versus the other? And we absolutely think you can. And the right founders we've seen really focus on hiring. They focus on the first 20, 30 hires. They actually really think of things like diversity and inclusion in those first 30, 40 hires. It's not really as much the board members and the VCs pushing it. It comes straight from the founders. And so, culture is a special thing. And the great thing is when it works, it's completely authentic.
And TOSIN, I'm going to want to come back to SONALI with this, but is that an Octopus view as well? Is that what SONALI is talking about baking in the culture that early?
Yeah, we have the fortune of being early, like really early stage investors, which means that in many cases we're looking at the people first. We're looking at the people, we're looking at the teams, we're looking at sort of the motivations. And I really liked the way sort of Anne framed it, and I guess Adam as well too framed the way you think about policing or law enforcement as part of like a value chain. And if you look purely at that, it's sort of the downstream focus only. And if you, so when we look for founders that actually are visionary, they have engaged, they don't only just think critically about the upstream like factors that influence this, but they have engaged actively. They spent ample amounts of time either working directly on those other upstream factors or building a team around them that really does round out the perspective they have on creating a vision that is indeed positive. And so we have the benefit of being able to do that on one hand. And also on the other hand, we also challenge ourselves regularly internally, our team, right? I say this often, and I say this it's not like advertising or PR, but it actually really is honestly how I feel. Octopus is the most self-reflective organization I've been in ever. And I've worked in government agencies, I've worked in other private sector companies, I've worked in the social.
You've worked in think tanks, but it's a VC fund that's, okay, just
exactly,
sure.
that are charged with thinking like of problems all the time, right? And it's partly because of the rapidity of change. Get feedback, change something, test it out, right? That's the beauty of this environment. It's also partly the reason why I wanted to come back to VC so much, is because the admitting that there is no perfect structure and system and we're constantly evolving, we have to constantly shift, is an essential part of the ethos of the organization. And I think that needs to be also built into the way people generally think about how to react to problems or react to less than ideal structures in their organizations.
And Adam, is that, in the conversations that you're having with the leadership of tech companies, the companies that get to talk to you are much, much larger than the companies that are coming to Octopus and Accel to ask for funding? Is it too late for them? How do you turn a ship that big?
I don't believe that it is too late, but like anything, leadership really has to commit in a way that will stimulate the incentive from the proletariat to manage up and create an urgency loop that will build that culture. It's hard work. It takes a lot of time, and time is the biggest enemy to any business, large or small. But what is I think the conversion that has to be made is leadership needs to understand that taking the time to build the frameworks and to build this urgency loop, the cost benefit of that weighs heavily in favor of creation of that time. We've been conditioned to believe that any time spent on anything other than driving revenue or development or whatever it is harming the overall growth of the company or the overall revenue. But it actually, government or private sector, in my mind, it actually will augment on the back end, will benefit the company greater by taking that time hit. And that's really a mindset shift that has been most difficult for me to express and to get across to leadership in those places.
Sonali, I want to ask you about some of these companies that you work with that have transitioned into this large stage that that Adam is talking about. I would be remiss if I didn't mention your Forbes Midas list inclusion and the fact that you have been ranked among the top 2 or 3 venture capital investors in Europe, and you've had all of these multi-billion-dollar exits. And it's not just in one dimension, whether it's Avito selling for close to $3 billion based in Russia, or your massive outcome in Spotify, or the fintech company that you helped sell for $2 billion plus within the last year. What's the common thread for these great leaders that you're finding in diverse fields?
So I thank you for that, Ed. That's great. When I'm feeling down, I'm just going to call you. So look, I think that in venture capital, it's something like, sub 10-15% of the capital that returns most of the money, and and the reality is we never know which when we start. So you're really just doing the work, and in the beginning they all look pretty much clearly they look different, and you'll have different views and outcome, but you never know when you're early. I mean, the thing that keeps us awake, and as most venture investors will acknowledge, it's very much the deal you don't know, because that's when your losses are uncapped, because it's you missed the Google. You could have had, the massive return. So it's really, in many ways, it's not just about what you do, it's about what you don't do. And of course, for us, the common thread in all those stories through our entire nearly 40-year history, 38 years to be precise, is really around the people, is around the individuals. And I think what I will say that I haven't said in terms of a common thread is the great founders, and it's not obvious in the first instance at all, but they learn at such a rate that it's almost astounding where they were the last time you met them. And which is why getting to know companies and building a relationship and seeing how the founder and the founding team think, especially the founder, and how they evolve is such an important part of the work we do. And what we do on Zoom now, which is the same, let's be very honest about it. But the way the founders learn, and these great founders, they may be kind of specialists in one area, but then they go to school and they really figure out everything there is around the product side. They don't become the experts, they hire them, but then they figure out what does it, what does a good fundraise look like? Or they figure out the business model, like what are the metrics that I should be thinking about? Or when they're doing a partnership deal, what makes it for a really great partnership deal? And I can keep going internationally. What's the right blueprint to expand internationally? Organization structure, should I do matrix, should I do this? And just the learning and the ability to be somebody who can do so many things at the same time, and really the curiosity to learn from other people, as opposed to I think I got it nailed. That is really one of the hallmarks of people who just keep going much further than most of us, right?
And,
we stop at some point.
And let's use a specific example of a French tech company that's entered the US market, that's backed by this London-based investor who likes the Nordics and other places. Shift. What was it about Jeremy and Shift that made you and Accel say, this is going to be a terrific founder?
So Shift is a insurance software business. It was a team that was straight out of university. They had done a few months at Accel, which is a big, one of the largest insurance companies, and they had a view, again, see the future first, have a view on how things are done, join the dots differently. They came up with a different product. And I think, Jeremy was an immigrant into France, immigrant in the US in the same manner. And he has this incredible capacity to learn and make bets, to be very thoughtful about why he's making them and work backwards. He does that in product. He does that in terms of fundraising. He does that in terms of his organization and his hiring. I think we were really compelled with his vision for what software in the insurance industry, which is, by the way, one of the industries that still is very early on the cloud journey, and what that would look like, and why he would be the protagonist to do it, and why France, actually, of all places, was a good place to start. And it makes sense because of the depth and size of the French industry. But really it was his roadmap. His roadmap was to how I was going to take the insurance industry into the next stage, how cloud was going to be the thing that they would use, and my solution around fraud and claims management would be the set of products that would enable them. So it's nothing different per se. I mean, one thing I'll say, which I think is really interesting, because you and I have talked about it, and somewhat in this context, Jeremy came straight out of school. We did this analysis where we looked at the 51 founders of our last two funds of the investments we had done. And 51 founders had come from 44 different schools. So there's no archetype, there's no signal, there's no obvious CV that a European founder has. There's a lot of cognitive diversity. There's a lot of socioeconomic diversity. So I can't answer the question of what they look like or their CV. It's very much about approach, but it's a very culturally nuanced approach.
I'm so glad you got that reference in, because I wanted to make sure that we did touch upon that. And I saw someone on Twitter yesterday who had the Twitter bio, and he talked about having made over 100 angel investments, mostly from YC companies, which means the funnel narrows before you take the time. So how do you sift through all of these opportunities? And then I'm going to shift after you take off, I'm going to shift to Adam, because I want to know what he's looking for, and I have a specific question for him on that. But how are you sifting through all of these opportunities to find that founder, especially given that you don't use that traditional screen that we in the States use?
Yeah, no, it is a good point, and it is really a challenge because you talked about why Sweden was so interesting. Almost 8 years ago, we have zero bias. We have no idea where the next great entrepreneur will come from, and we refuse to actually predict that. So the whole question is, are you open-minded enough? Do you have a mental model where you think somebody sitting in some part of Siberia has a shot at building something incredible? And so that's the bias that we go into, which is there is no bias. And we use a lot of data. I think we have more than 1 million kind of companies that are in our scrubbed CRM, which means and I think that makes you pretty agnostic, right, in terms of background, et cetera. So we're going way out of our network in terms of just the top of the funnel. Of course, when you get to the bottom of the funnel, there's a lot we only have limited time to meet a certain subsector of those companies. And the way we do that is then we're very thematic. So we really combine the kind of top-down data across Europe. We've invested in 35 cities in Europe, and these are like tier 3, tier 4 cities you've never heard of. That's in Europe alone. So it's a lot of ground that we cover. But then we're very, as I said, thematic, where we like to go deep in a space, and we like to form, kind of a protagonist view of what is the blueprint, what is the winning hand going to look like. And when we kind of see the founder that has that vision, we don't pretend to know the vision, but we kind of recognize parts of it, and they put it together. That was the Jeremy experience. We had a sense of what might be interesting, and then they articulate in a way that is incredibly insightful and convincing. That's when we jump on it. So I think it's the combination of the top down with the bottom thematic work.
Yeah,
amazing.
And if I may just quickly chime in.
Yeah.
I want to make also an obligatory sort of shout out to diversity. And what I mean by diversity is not just, not just the way we define diversity, in terms of socioeconomic or ethnic, but also like, in terms of ability or disability, in terms of a variety of things. And what do I say? Why do I say that? Because at its core, a VC fund is a collection of individuals, pseudo-autonomously or completely autonomously, going out, developing their own networks, their own relationships, their own, to Sonali's point, their own different worlds that they think are interesting and have interesting gaps that technology solutions could, drive to solutions. And they are then investing. And so the point I'm trying to make is that if you bring a crop of diverse thinkers, diverse interests, diverse perspectives, diverse geographic contexts that these people come from, right? You broaden the aperture of your firm as a whole and its ability to see interesting things that stretch beyond the proverbial YC, path or funnel. And so that's always important to bear in mind, is that at the end, we are still individuals going out, building relationships, seeking great companies. And we shouldn't lose track of the fact that is the case. And that makes a broader argument for a diverse crop of individuals within a firm.
Completely agree. And that's terrific. I know, Sonali, you have to take off. And I want to thank you. You and I will try to spearhead the Buy College in Venture, all 7 people around the globe, and we'll put that together. But thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Adam. And I'm sorry that I won't hear the end of it, but I'm sure it will be taped. And TOSIN, it was great to be on the panel with you. Thank you, everybody who's on the chat. Okay.
Thanks, Sonali. Okay, and please do stay with us. And Sonali left us with a couple of great things to follow up with Anne and Adam on. We're going to continue the conversation about venture and startups with TOSIN as well. But there were 2 points that that she made, and I will start with Anne, because when she talked about all of these data points, TOSIN, you are not off the hook. You're staying with us. You know that, right?
We lost TOSIN.
No, we did not lose TOSIN.
He's back.
I'm here. Apologies. I thought that the stage was for Adam and Anne. So
no, you're still stuck with us, man. We're not done with venture stuff. But right. Anne, when she talked about the million data points, when you took over, when you did the Camden takeover in 2000, and that's probably the wrong phrase for it, but in 2008, you had them go through filing cabinets with handwritten notes that no one had seen before because you wanted the data. So it's a similar approach. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think people don't understand how critical data can be in public safety, and frankly, I think that it's just a space that we've allowed anecdote and gut to try to basically rule the day, and it's really to all of our disadvantage when it comes to equity or fairness or public safety. It's a huge mistake because, I mean, we know this in countless other spaces, but our instincts are often wrong and our anecdotes are often wrong. Camden is a great example, and just to go back to something that Sonali said, one of the advantages that I had when I became AG is that I'd been a prosecutor my whole career. I, have family members who were police officers, but I'd never worked in a police department. I never ran a police department. All I knew is that there was a lot I didn't know. And so I started asking a lot of questions, and I came to it with really fresh eyes. And I was asking really basic questions like, why in a city of 80,000 people are there nearly 15,000 911 calls a year, right? We were the most dangerous city in America, but that is an extraordinary number of 911 calls. And I will tell you that if you look at any of the other extremely dangerous cities in America today, you will find that they're similar, right? That they're basically in this 911 call loop. And so I started asking these questions, and those questions no one could answer, or they answered them in a way that it was clear they didn't know what they were doing. And so we literally sent people in to pull the information, to create data. And that let us solve problems, right? Within 1 year, we were able to take the 911 calls from almost 15,000 to under 4,000. What does that mean? That transformation, and it was largely data driven. It also, I could tell you the story in more detail, it involves a lot of fights with unions and others. But basically, at the end of the day, we were able to put officers on the street because they weren't just responding to 911 calls. But I would never have done that if I didn't get the data to understand what was really driving the problems and what was really issues in the community and what weren't. And so the sort of short answer on the 911 calls, just so people know and don't wonder, is that when you dispatch officers because you think you know who the closest officer is, and you actually don't know for sure who the closest officer is, you almost always do it wrong. So you end up sending a unit of police officers to a crime scene that is across town, and they might be across town for a great reason, like they're interviewing a witness or a victim, or they could actually be across town because they're taking a break. I actually didn't care, right? And it took me a long time to convince the unions that I didn't care, that I wanted GPS on the police cars because I wanted to automatically dispatch whatever police unit was closest to that 911 call for service. And literally what we found in Camden is that people were repeatedly calling because no cops were showing up, and that people were actually not always truthful about what was happening. So they were saying shots fired or someone was just stabbed when in fact their car had been stolen, because they knew that if they didn't do that, the police wouldn't respond, or they would respond in 5 hours and they would never get justice. And so that became a loop. And then when we start to talk more about leadership and culture, it was a loop that the police department was in and they couldn't see their way out of it. So data was this turnkey for basically getting folks to understand what was actually really happening, and that there were solutions that were actually not that complicated. I mean, the 911 reboot we did was one of the most inexpensive things we did in the city of Camden. And yet all of a sudden, cops who were sitting in police cars racing from 911 to 911 were all of a sudden walking city streets, becoming a part of the community. And so data, and that's just one of countless examples I could give you of how important it was to just understand what was happening, where was the crime actually coming from, where were the officers, what were the officers doing, what were the needs in the community. And it literally shifted the department in such a significant way. And I could talk a lot more about why I think data is also critical as we go through this reform movement. But to me, it's one of those really basic things that in startups and in major companies today, they wouldn't think about making these critical decisions without understanding some of the basic things we were trying to understand. And yet we've like literally accepted it in policing, in prosecution, in courts, in jails and prisons. And I would argue like it's very much to our detriment because we can't see sort of what the solutions are. And some of the solutions are not that complicated.
And I want to talk to Adam a little bit about that gut instinct, which is sort of the other end of this, right? Anne was moving people away from the gut instinct into the data. But Adam, you had an Instagram post about Josh who asked you a question after you were keynoting at his college, and the question was about how you funnel tax revenue from the check cashers, liquor stores, and bodegas back into our communities where they disproportionately affect our people, instead of spreading that revenue across the state to communities where they don't exist. And that seems to me the way that you felt about Josh and what you did just in that moment seemed a lot like the way TOSIN or SONALI might gravitate toward a particular founder. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, and this is something that is like near and dear to my heart. It is sort of the mantra of the criminal justice reform movement that those who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. And because we have sort of conditioned ourselves to believe, unless you are an erudite academic who has all sorts of initials after your last name, your thoughts or opinions on solutions are somehow diminished. And what I try to drive through the minds of everybody that I talk to is, because of all of these systems that we've created, we are missing out on a tremendous amount of talent that we are never going to understand what we've been deprived of unless we tax hard into all of this reform to allow people like Josh to get into C-suites, to get into leadership positions in government and in the private sector, and the sort of latency to do so. The fact that we are not all striving to do this tells me that we don't know what we're missing out on. If we knew that I can go into any community college classroom and find a Josh across this country, should have every venture person, every CEO, every elected official thinking like, I want to do that and find those people to be on my team, because you can just find this, you know, like I live and breathe and eat and sleep this stuff, and I'd never thought of, yeah, why is that? I always talked about it the opposite. I thought it was so messed up that the check cashing place in my neighborhood was attached to the liquor store. And so like had a lot of feelings about that impropriety, that direction, but I never thought about the conversion, the transition, that these places are generating revenue, that revenue is going and being dispersed across the state, and the impact that it is those buildings are having is on this community that is completely divested from. I was thinking about it while Sonali was talking, but you're absolutely right. This is what we're missing out on, and it's not just Josh who's in college. They're the people who are sitting in our jails and prisons. They're sitting in juvenile detention facilities and homeless shelters. And I know that it is a sort of like a culture clash for us to think about it in that way, because we have judgments about people who end up in those places. But if we start to think about the reason that they're there as health related and access related, then maybe we can get to this culture where we understand that there's a whole universe of people that we haven't even tapped into yet. And that brings me a lot of optimism.
Yeah, and you said health related and access related. You didn't say, and also systemic racism. But I know that is an enormous piece of it. And you gave a talk last year in which you cited a stat that 12 million people were captured and enslaved during hundreds of years of slavery in this country. Last year, and that's 2018, 11 million people went through our jails. And that's, you know, those are remarkable numbers. On the access point, there's also this interesting issue of your background informs your view of what's going on in the world. And I want us to all spend a little bit of time on that, because TOSIN gave this amazing talk, which I recommend to everyone, in Berlin about his thesis on fintech investing of all things. And one of the things I found so unique about it was that he tells his life story a bit, including pictures. There's a great picture of TOSIN in a cape as a kid. And I believe he's kind of a superhero, where you don't usually see that personalization, particularly in venture. And in part, it's because of what you said, Adam, about how, you know, if you don't have a lot of like PhD, JD, whatever, after your name, people don't credit you for having a particular view. So we spend a lot of time trying to make our view academically credible. And venture is, you know, there's an extent to which it's really an elitist field. And where, you know, more than I wrote in the Wall Street Journal's accelerators page in 2013 that more than half of all VCs went to the same 10 schools, and it was a 90+% white or non-black field then. It's you know, still like 1%. It's crazy how non-diverse it is. And yet here's this opportunity to say, we have people who see things differently. They're going to understand different markets. And I know that people have had that problem when companies I've invested in or companies that I've seen are looking for unbanked and underbanked markets, people in those markets. And those markets often, not always, but often don't compute with a lot of VCs. TOSIN, can you talk a little bit about how the view from your seat informs your fintech thesis?
Yeah, so much of what Adam said is really convicting, or continues to be convicting, and I'm still sort of on a journey of really trying to bridge that gap, and even sort of remove me in some ways out of the equation. And what I mean by that is this: is that so like your critique of Yale at the beginning, Ed, really resonated, in part because I'm extremely critical of Yale personally, right? My experience in Yale was in some ways the time when I lost my religion, so to speak. I was acutely aware of the fact that there is this premium put on intellectualizing a problem, or the logical argument being the right argument, right? And that's a bias, and that's a sort of, that's a tax on the quote unquote underprivileged, as defined as like having access to these spaces, that continues in society. And what I'm trying to get at now with my sort of financial inclusion focus is to not just be the representative, so to speak, of that perspective, but to get to the point where the voices of those who can really, really understand the details from lived experience of, you know, the liquor store next to the payday loan space can actually be the voices driving the investment in those spaces, right? Like the broader thesis for those who haven't seen the video, who I haven't talked to about this, is that like financial inclusion is important in looking at frontier markets and looking at the global South, or the unbanked, so to speak, but we refuse to, or have refused to historically, fit those within the Western context that are on the margins of the economic system, or margins of financial services products, and you know that we all enjoy, or many of us enjoy now. And so sort of to refocus, or to add into the conversation the kinds of things that Adam was talking about is essential. And to some extent, I can share that conversation, but to some extent, I'm privileged. I went to Yale, I went to Duke, Like I have lived experience-wise away from some of these challenges. And so it's about broadening the conversation. It's about bringing those who are not in that conversation in the conversation, and also stepping back a bit on the part of the VCs who feel so, I mean, we are all to some extent like narcissistic and love to lead the conversations, but we need to step back a bit often, and let others who are better positioned to actually address these solutions do so.
And when you're thinking about these fintech companies, can you give us an example of a company that you've looked at that you particularly like, that you find particularly exciting?
Yeah, yes, there's one that we've invested in. It's a solution that effectively allows you to rethink what the data points for identifying credit worthiness for somebody would be, right? And so this company is called AIR, and AIR effectively isn't just, it's doing multiple things. One, it's powering a consumer lender's way of assessing creditworthiness of individuals. So creating atypical data points, and importantly, it's asking those who wish to get, you know, loans from X, Y, or Z consumer lender to provide information outside of your run-of-the-mill credit agencies that informs sort of an assessment of creditworthiness. That's one thing. In addition to that, it's powering existing credit agencies' ways of like thinking about assessing individuals and their creditworthiness and their ability to be lent, et cetera, et cetera. And that is, it's a simple but important way of diversifying the conversation around what makes one worthy to participate in the financial services like ecosystem. And that thing, like that's one sort of I guess, macro approach to addressing that issue. And then there's some sort of super micro approaches that I'm really excited about, right? There's a company I just met recently. It's super, super early. In fact, it's just an idea at the moment. But in this sort of similar credit and lending space, a couple of people have come together and said, we believe that credit card rates are predatory in many ways, and they're actually making money off of the relatively underprivileged in society, because those people are less sophisticated in their ability to understand exactly the kinds of hidden fees, et cetera, and so they want to build a bank that is actually connected through sort of employers and employees and through large working class sort of unions or collectives, and in so doing, provide more competitive rates sort of through sort of a collective pooling of individuals from sort of points of entry that they already have. Like, you already work with a bunch of other people sort of in the working class in a particular sort of organization. Why should your assessment be made alongside or in relation to a hedge fund manager, right? And so it's a rethinking of the way you pool people to assess creditworthiness, to give out sort of like more competitive rates, et cetera, et cetera. That, as I said, is a super, super early company. And I was going to spend 30 minutes talking to them, and I spent 2.5 hours kicking out around ideas at the onset, right? Because going back to one of the points we made earlier, they're invested in not just the conversation about the technology solution, but about the macro issues that affect individuals and their ability to be participatory in this like broader economic system we have.
So I'm now turning it over to Adam and Ann. TOSIN, don't go away. You're stuck with us. And the way I want to turn this over is, TOSIN just talked about the fact that a company like Air is getting more customers into the system. And when Ann and Adam are separately sitting down and being called upon by Facebook and Netflix and others to meet with the CEOs of those companies, one of the ways I think you're pitching this is, if you're Facebook and Netflix, you want more people right here in America to have iPhones or iPads so that they can be your consumers. That's an inclusion, not because inclusion is the right thing to do, but because coincidentally, you'll make more freaking money. And so I'd love, give us a bird's eye view, both of you, and then Ann, it's on you to carry, of what's going on in those conversations with these world-leading companies that you're having.
My conversations have all been around essentially policing reform and criminal justice reform. And so I've had a lot of tech CEOs from startups to much more established companies reach out and basically say, just talk me through it. Talk me through what's happening. Talk me through what's happened in Camden and how you basically did that. And those conversations have been incredibly illuminating, in part because I think, and I think Adam may feel the same. I think we all watch Law and Order, we watch TV shows about policing, and we all have this visceral sense that we understand it. And yet the sort of piping of it and the mechanics of how it works in practice, I think, are kind of a surprise to people. I mean, SONALI talked a little bit about leadership, and Adam talked about leadership. Most people don't understand that to become a police chief in America, you're usually somebody who's been on the job for 23 years. You're literally promoted at the end. That police departments do not reward innovation. There are civil service rules who even really tightly cabin who can even be eligible to be a police chief. I mean, one of the things we did in Camden, which, I still think was one of the most important keys to reform, was that the person who we worked for 2 years with and basically felt like he was the only person who really got it and was innovative with us, had only 14 years on the job, hadn't taken the civil service test to be a chief. We were able to, because Camden was in such dire straits, civil service rules were basically put on hold. So we were able to put him into a leadership position. But I think people don't understand how cabined the leadership, the sort of mechanics of even selecting leaders and the ability to really run something and to sort of push reform is. So that's one piece of the conversation, is I think just getting people up to speed on what needs to be done. What I tell people a lot, and I don't know if Adam agrees with this, but look, what we did in Camden in 1 year when I was AG, we essentially dropped murders by more than 40%. The actual public safety piece of it, we know that. It's straightforward. It's not easy, but it's simple. What is much more complicated are the culture and the politics and the leadership questions and how you work with communities, right? And so how do you build accountability into systems? How do you build the community into everything you do so it's no longer us versus them, but it's us and us? And eventually that line, there's no line, it's just us, right? And so a lot of the conversations have just been setting that out and being really clear. Another piece of the conversations, and then I want to really throw it to Adam, and I have a ton of questions for Adam too. So like one of the things, and I want to come back to something that Adam just talked about with, the 12 million Americans who were incarcerated last year. And I just want to say really clearly that I think we fail to understand something that is so fundamental, which is that our problems are systemic, whether it's housing or education or mental health, like they are systemic, and yet our blame is individual, right? And so I could not say enough how people have to flip the way they understand this, because it is really easy. And again, if you just wait till something's happened and you pull everything else away from that, you may have a situation where someone has created a harm to someone else or a harm in a community. And if you slowly isolate at that moment in time, then the way the system actually responds is people understand that, right? It sort of makes sense. If you broaden out the lens to see that we have created this sort of piping and infrastructure that is deeply systemically broken, that leads to these results, and that crime is generally not the thing, but it is the end result of many other things, with a few exceptions. But generally, like there is, and we pulled this in Camden, we pulled the health and the crime and some of the education data. And what you see are all these things happening, and then downstream is the crime. And so again, I think it's really important to understand, like, you can't just look, it's easy to blame the individuals at the end. And if you only have that lens, that's the situation we live in, right? Because that's the lens we've taken. Part of this reform conversation really has to be pulling it back to the systemic, the wiring and the foundation being broken. And otherwise, the reforms, while important, will just never break us through to having sort of this type of equity and fairness and opportunity in society that we all obviously want. And Adam, I'm going to turn it to you to talk about the conversations you've been having, and I'm curious to know if they're the same or different.
They're both, and I want to get to that, but I want to go back to your point on the 12 million people in jail, because it's like, and it's a number that we have a hard time wrestling with. What 12 million people who over the course of 365 days are sort of like shuttling through jails. So let's unpack the number. 12 million people went through our jails. The average length of stay for people was 23 days. So you have some people who go in for a night and they bail out. You have some people who go in for a couple months. You have some people who are held for a year or two on pretrial detention. 12 million people, average length of stay is 23 days at an average cost of $58 per day. Okay? On the back end of that, what we found was 95% of those people don't receive an incarcerated sentence after they've been held pretrial, meaning that somebody has determined that they are okay to be outside, and therefore the incarceration on the front end was kind of useless. I am not a mathematician, so I'm not going to hazard doing that math on the fly. But if you think about all of that money as what it is, which is waste, we have not had a modicum of any impact. I'll say any impact with a margin of error on public safety, because the next year there's just another 12 million people going through the jail. You would think with an investment of that amount of money that you would see a dramatic impact on safety, but we don't. We see the opposite. And so you wonder what would just happen if we spent that money elsewhere. And the conversion of the conversation to the private sector is when I did my TED Talk, it opened up a lot of doors, and one of those doors was being asked to be sort of that speaker on like Martin Luther King Day or during Diversity Week, or to the social responsibility team or the DE&I team about the work that I did. And the companies were doing those things to try to bring business into their corporations and to create an environment for their workers that felt more diverse than perhaps the workers were happy with, and certainly the customers who were not showing up were saying. And the sort of like first few times I was having these conversations, I was trying to make the case that you need to care about mass incarceration and the degradation of these communities, because it is an inhumane thing. It's embarrassing to our legacy. It affects all of us. It's affecting your kids, and really try to appeal the hearts and the minds. And Ed, the point that you made during asking the question was, I had to shift tactics and start talking to people about their bottom line, and understand that 70 million Americans have criminal records, and that reduces the likelihood not only that they are participating in the economy, but they are buying your products. The fact that your C-suite or your workforce is lacking diversity is not because all of the Stanfords and the Columbia kids got to the place that they are and everybody else who didn't fail because they didn't deserve to be here. It is because of these structures and institutions that in many ways your corporations are playing in, and I bet you don't even know. So let's talk about that. And it became a strategic conversation that, like, did it feel good? No. But when you can attach these values to somebody's personal or professional incentive, that's when you see this shift start happening. If I go in and I start talking about mass incarceration to a Fortune 100 company, and they have rarely ever interacted with people of color or with people who are from marginalized communities, there's nothing that I can say to get to the personal or professional incentive of that person the way that I can when I'm talking about how it is affecting their bottom line. And those are the conversations that we are having. And in doing so, it is allowing us to, again, create that urgency loop that I talked about before, where the onboarding is not about, like, I'm not going to come and do a speech and settle everybody down and call it quits on Martin Luther King Day. I need from you the commitment to build frameworks of time into your corporate calendar so that you are dealing with these issues and demonstrating not only to your employees, but also to the public that this isn't just something you do for Diversity Week. This is a core value of your company. We don't have to put out into the public why that core value is, but the net effect is the same.
Adam, so I'm just going to ask you a question that just as you're sitting here talking, I agree 100%, but it just begs the sort of question of, like, when you and I think about government, and we have to be honest that public safety is run by government, right? So the police, the prosecutors, the jails, the courts, they're government entities, and they may have different bosses, the mayor or the county, but they're all government. And that's because it's the power of the state. When you think about that, like, so one of the ways you get through to corporations is by basically saying, like, look, this is your bottom line. Like, we know you're measured by this. We know you care about this. This is a huge incentive for you. What's the bottom line in government, right? Like, how do we take that to government? Because the reality is, like, you know, corporations are driven by, like, profit and by, you know, efficiency is a part of the DNA, and often by data and sort of understanding how to get from A to Z. And then you look at government, and in so many ways, I mean, having now worked with private companies that in government, I can say, like, government is so far behind. And some of it is that government is meant to be public service, right? And so they sort of think that they're aligned with the right outcomes. But, you know, how do we think about this in sort of changing these institutions? Because that's very powerful what you just said, and I could see it working in a company. Like, what do we do in government to get to the same point? I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Gotcha. So the easy answer to that for me, the sort of like short hack answer is elections, and all of the things that come with elections. People don't run for office because they want to, like, do all the things to run an office. They want to be someone who is loved by the community, who can stay in this place, who can speak on behalf of a body of people, and they enjoy that for all the reasons that people who go into elections, and maybe TOSIN, to your point earlier, go into venture, we enjoy that part. And to be an elected official who is constantly taking a hit because you are failing, I think is an interesting way to create urgency to at least introduce that person to different modes of business to achieve something that will give them that frankly oxytocin hit, just like I feel good. The other urgency for me is what we never talk about are all of the manifestations of unhappy workers going to work. And the government we have for centuries sort of steeled ourselves as these people who are public servants. We're just going into the fire. We use all this language as if we are somehow different human beings, that people that go work at a company that are now talking about mindfulness and wellness and open space and working from home and all of the things. When I'm talking to prosecutors' offices and they're talking to me about the talent gap between 3 years and 10 years and what that causes in terms of culture and disruption in that office, it's often framed as a problem that we're not paying people enough. But, like, none of us went into the government to make money. We went there to achieve something that is less tangible. And that burnout, to me, is caused by telling folks that you are going to be this public servant, that you're going to make the public safer, that victims are going to trust you and want to be around you, that people are going to be treated fairly. when you don't see that happening and you continue to be in that business and work in that business, and you're being measured by metrics that have nothing to do with any of those things, it creates this burnout that is harmful in lots and lots of ways. And I think in this period of time, we have an opportunity to use both of those urgencies to shift culture.
So one of our folks just said, what about publicly tracked KPIs? And you know this, but we have a project with the NYU lab I run to essentially do this in Indianapolis, because this is one of my theories, is that we actually sort of measure public safety the wrong way, right? Police departments do it by arrests, prosecutors' offices do it by convictions, and we need to have a very different measurement of what public safety is. But I also think that we have to have a real conversation about the public KPIs, because to your point on elections, look, we're asking, like, and there has to be so much more community involvement, but we're not giving the information to the communities to make, like, in order for elections to work and really hold people accountable, people have to have information on which to judge. And right now, very much that information is controlled, and it's the wrong KPIs, right? Arrests do not tell you whether communities are safe, equitable, or just. They don't tell you whether you're giving people opportunities. And so this is our Indianapolis project, is to totally change this. I want to bring TOSIN back in with this, because TOSIN said something that it was like literally, like, in my head, I was hearing it and I was like, it's probably the opposite of what Adam and I experienced in our work experience in government as prosecutors, which is the following. You were talking about how you get feedback, you change, and you test it out, how there's this constant evolution, right? And there's like this incredible innovation and like movement in, I think, startups and companies that comes out of that process. And it is almost the opposite of what I would say my experience in government was. And so I guess, like, it's like a really interesting question of, like, how do we bring sort of like some of that mentality, which is very much, I think, a mentality of technology and innovation and startups, into a space that is essentially ossified, in part because of civil service rules, in part because of people don't want to put their head up, they're afraid they're going to be fired and they want their pension. Like, there's countless reasons, but I just, like, that resonated with me so much as, like, if we could do one thing of sort of changing the way people approach problems and think about how they run their institutions. So I sort of turn it to both of you to just think this through maybe a little bit with us.
Yeah,
Tosin, before you go, I just want to hop on that last point, because a lot of like the anxiety of prosecutors who are being asked to reform is not that they don't get that, like, what it's currently working is failing. We're lawyers, we build cases on evidence. You can't look around and be like, we're doing a good job. The fear comes because we have no good way in government, in prosecutors' offices, and in police to say, you're doing a good job by these metrics because of all the things that Anne just wanted to talk about. So I just wanted to add that little bit of context for you, Tosin.
Yeah, and almost unfortunately, I don't think I have the answer to your question. I'm still seeking the answer, to be honest. So, like, my foil is that, like, I literally came from government into, you know, my work with Octopus Ventures. And so I saw that starkly, right? I saw that difference. In fact, I chased a space where there was much, so, like, faster of a feedback loop in going here. And I want to steer away from the peril of, like, and this is sort of a doctrine taught all the time in business school, private sector thinking in the public context. It sounds cute, but it can actually lead to a lot of sort of problematic, quantifiable objective chasing, or quantifiable outcome chasing, I guess I should say. Still TBD, to be honest, and as I think about how that could actually be injected into the public sector such that it works. But that's a project that I'm, like, it's part of my life's work in some way, because I'm acutely, like, aware of this and super interested in the outcome or desired outcome in this space. I have a different question to ask you both, but I don't want to
Please, no, jump in, please.
Okay. Well, this question sort of veers back to some of what you talked about. So, and you've mentioned these social factors that influence the outcome that is sort of a crime, quote unquote. And I kept on thinking to myself, like, how much leverage does sort of an AG or a prosecutor, like, you know, to point to Adam, have in shaping the legislation that then these law enforcement agents have to enforce, right? Because the example that keeps coming to mind is with the case of Eric Garner, right? There was a police officer that was enforcing, or believed himself to be enforcing, a Lucy law, a law that in and of itself was disproportionately affecting people of certain backgrounds and certain socioeconomic contexts, etc. And one can make a credible argument, and many people have, that that law by itself was problematic in the way it was sort of shaped, crafted, and the tools provided to law enforcement to actually enforce it. But does law enforcement have an actual say in shaping that upstream issue such that it doesn't become a measure of just taking that which you're told? That's the question that just keeps coming to my head.
So I would say one thing, which is when I was AG, and New Jersey is unique because New Jersey, the AG is the chief law enforcement officer. So I had 10,000 people under my direct control, 5,000 state troopers, the Canada Police Department, all these prosecutors. It's one of sort of 4 or 5 states where the AG has full criminal jurisdiction. So we should say it's a really unique space. And I think the lack of that, if there being one person who can oversee system-wide in other states, is one of the reasons we see some issues, right? The AG in New Jersey, New Jersey was one of the first states to require mandatory taping of interviews, require saving of police notes. And all of that is because there's a sort of chain of command that goes outside the law enforcement space. So I think that's a separate conversation, but I think it's worth noting here. But I will tell you, I literally had 3 people in a legislative, and they worked day and night to push back on legislative reforms that we thought were harmful, were not fair, were contrary to public safety. And it was a full-time job for basically 3 people. And so I think it's worth having this conversation, and really important to have the conversation, because there's a huge divide also in like who gets a say. And I think we all know this, but look, one of the conversations we're having now nationally is about the role of unions in policing. And unions raise dues, they make political contributions. I can promise you that where anyone is sitting, there is not a single person sitting in the United States of America who's state legislator, federal legislators, mayors, governors, who don't have the union people on speed dial, right? And vice versa. And so we should be really honest about who has input right now into those laws and what those laws are. And I don't have an answer for what the right process is, but I can tell you that every time something bad happens, every local legislator wants to pass a law to that specific situation. And a lot of times it's just that things happen that we wish didn't happen. It's really the wrong way to look at these problems. And it's super reactive, and it's super specific, and it's missing all of these other spaces where I think people should be having conversations. But I'll turn it to Adam, other than to say, like, I mean, there were days that I was like literally spending half a day pushing back on bad laws. Nobody ever sees it. But it was literally a game of whack-a-mole some days. Adam, do you have a?
Yeah, I'll give a really quick.
I think you're on mute.
You guys got me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Cool. I'll give a really quick anecdote to make the point that Anne was making. During the time that I was a prosecutor, some man got on the train and was taking his cell phone and taking pictures up women's skirts on the subway, and he was caught immediately. The people on the subway wrestled this guy down and called the police, and the police realized, well, actually that's not illegal. There was actually, because of the technology, there was no law that said that you couldn't do that. And because of the access this person had, or the privilege that she had was able to call directly to the district attorney. The district attorney rallied all of the other district attorneys. They go to the state house, and within 2 days, we have the upskirting law. And you see that, to Anne's point, all the time it is reactionary. And when they need it to happen, when it is a particular set of people who are demanding that sort of urgency, because they have the connections, because they have the capital, because they are influential in elections, we can make that turnaround happen. When it is the community that has been oppressed in many ways and distrustful of the system, engaging the system and civically, they are seen as less valuable, and so there is less urgency when those people are marching 55,000 people deep in the street saying change these laws. Even when they do, though, you think about the chokehold ban after the Eric Garner case, or maybe even before the Eric Garner case. You think about the no-knock warrant law that they passed in Kentucky because of Breonna Taylor. We passed these laws, but you've done nothing to change the culture. And what is really troubling about that is that we claim victory for this thing that is very apparent, but then we have no way to actually measure whether or not it is being adhered to or it has changed anything, because again, we don't collect the data. And even more subversively, unless you change the culture, we will find a way to end around the law. When we had,
yeah.
Go ahead, Ann. Go ahead.
Can I jump in on that? Because one of the things I also think we are not talking enough about is the fact that mayors appoint police chiefs, and they generally know nothing about, their backgrounds are not in criminal justice. They know nothing about law enforcement. If you think about, you know, who's putting people in positions of power with, you know, and what their backgrounds are, I cannot tell you how many times the most important thing I could say as AG was no. And I oversaw all the wiretaps. I oversaw statewide, like there were countless times where I had the background and the ability to know when law enforcement or someone was asking for something that was legitimate and correct, and when the answer was that it was not legitimate or correct, or was an overreach and a power grab. And the fact of the matter is that most mayors, most city councils, they do not understand what's necessary, what's legitimate. It's a very one-sided conversation where, again, we don't release law enforcement data. So the people in the community have very little insight into truthfully what's happening. And so, you know, how we run and how we oversee law enforcement, I cannot begin to tell you how much I think it also has to be a part of the conversation, because otherwise we're sort of like, you know, we're really putting people in a position where they're not going to make necessarily the right decision on the laws or on the appointments or even on contracts and approval of collective bargaining agreements. They just don't have the 360 to do it correctly. And yet we keep expecting that they're going to do it better. I also want to say one other thing, which you know, I sort of look to all of you for insight on this, and I have been thinking a lot about this, particularly as we go on the ground in Indianapolis, but just generally, I sort of feel like we've created a society in which we have very much siloed ourselves in terms of government institutions. And so we have a healthcare space, we have a housing space, we have you know, an education space. And it turns out when you look at the 360 of people's lives, we touch all of those, right? And people have these constant, you know, one person, if you and I walked into the health, you know, an ER today, we would see one picture of people's lives. If we walked into an education department, we would see another. And this really came home to me in Camden, where we did some data work and found that all these kids were missing school. And the week that they were missing school, they or their moms were in the ERs. And we had never connected those data points before. And it is a really powerful moment, because I think a lot of people think about kids missing school. That's 20 or more days in many states leads to juvenile justice, potential charges, right, and incarceration, which is, in my view, absurd, but also just the nature of where we are today. And I think we've always thought those kids have agency. And then you pull the data and you actually come to see that probably there's a nice nurse giving that kid, you know, apple juice and graham crackers, and nobody's asking the question of how do we get you to school tomorrow, right? How do we break this cycle, particularly if the kid has healthcare needs or the mom has healthcare needs. And so what I've come to believe is, like, we've actually done this incredible thing to run government, like, so the healthcare systems are more easily run if we just look at the health side of you. The housing departments are much more easily run if we just look at your housing. And yet we are missing the 360 of all the things we talk about that actually lead to poor health outcomes, lots more crime, a lot less safety in communities. To me right now, I mean, my thinking is that data is the way to knit this back together, but I'm really interested in whether that's a complicated process that we're undertaking in some places. But it's like, to me, like, this is one of the sort of key questions of silos are bad for innovation. We've siloed ourselves into all these different parts. And now the question is, like, how do we sort of work beyond and out of this to try to, like, sort of change our structures? That's just my small final question for you both.
I think that what we need to realize is that a lot of this culture is built before I actually even get on the job. And so as a prosecutor, I'm being vindicated and validated all the time. I passed I get a good score on my LSAT. I'm now in law school. I'm told all through law school about all of the pomp and circumstance of the legal profession and how great I am. I decide that I want to be in the criminal justice system, and the language that we use around our system in law school is justice is blind, and we have the best justice system on the planet and all the fairness and equity. And I'm told all of those things, and then I get this job at the DA's office, and I go in, and I never realized walking into the DA's office that I had the same 84 credit hours as literally every other lawyer that graduated that year. And yet I chose this job where you were putting into my hands the discretion to ruin somebody's life with one decision. And if you think about the other professions that have that amount of discretion, one, they rarely, if ever, give it to the first, like the newest frontline worker. And if they're going to do so, they have an incredible amount of training and supervision, both of which is untrue of neither of which is true of the criminal justice system. And I have nothing to, there is nothing to measure whether or not I'm achieving anything. I'm just being told that I'm doing a good job. And that doing a good job is how many trials do you get? How many of them do you take to conviction? Are your files organized? Does the defense bar like you? Do the judges like you? None of those metrics have anything to do with whether or not this person who is standing in front of me is going to harm the community anymore. And so what we need to do, and is what is why I started my company, is trying to socialize these ideas around the use of data, for one, but also the understanding, like silos are built because I was told that my function was victim offender. And in fact, there's a culture around suggesting that I should do anything else as subordinate work. There's a mantra, and I know that you know it, there's a mantra that's like, I didn't come to law school to be a social worker, which is a wild and arrogant concept when you think about like what our job is and what we're being asked to do. And while I understand that our law degree somehow takes us out of the realm of perhaps being a community organizer, a grassroots worker, for us not to understand what trauma is, for us not to understand how poverty affects people's decision making, how addiction and mental health and the confluence of those things determine what like ultimately the outcomes of our cases, is abhorrent. It is negligent. And so we built this company to fill that gap in the best way that we possibly can, given the time that we have. It's not nearly sufficient, but it is necessary to try to socialize some of these issues, including these concepts around data, and understanding that it is not your enemy, that it is a wildly useful tool, and it will be a way that we can, at the end of the day, say we did a good job and actually have something to point to. That's my soapbox for now.
And I agree with the point about data. I mean, that's the business that I'm in right now. I really do see significantly the value of sort of collecting data, understanding data, reading data, and acting accordingly. I think even the qualitative narrative around what these issues are and how to think about how they interconnect. And I think this is to one of the points Adam made. This has been in sort of over-intellectualized, almost like siloed conversation that has come from on high, right? The categories of these things have in some ways been defined by the ways we think about it, from like this sort of pseudo-academic narrative of the problems that like affect society. And there needs to be an increased push to just listen. And what I mean by that is like, listen to people who are affected by these problems disproportionately. Listen to those for whom poverty is a lived experience. It's not a hypothetical problem that one needs to address in society. And from that, begin to better understand how these things are interconnected in one's life and what are the levers, right? And that's a work in progress for sort of me individually, right? For our politics as a country, it needs to be a work in progress, right? And also for the those in the different agencies within the government and even beyond that are thinking critically about how these issues should be addressed. Like it's beyond the how to address it. I think the what needs to be sort of reframed from the perspective of those outside of these ivory tower, having these ivory tower conversations about what issues affect society. And so like I'm increasingly impressed, like that point is increasingly sort of impressed on me, and I'm learning a ton. I mean, personal experience is like Ed has been really generous in describing my background and whatnot. My brother is a working class actor based in San Francisco who is a community organizer who's like really, really knee deep into labor politics. And I cannot emphasize how much I learn from him every single time about a complete, and we come from the same, cut from the same cloth, et cetera, but a different perspective on the ills affecting society. Like that is like, it's as if I'm going to like school again when I talk to him. And I'm in some ways unlearning some of the ways I think about the problems affecting society. And I think that should be almost extrapolated. That kind of conversation needs to be extrapolated widely.
Yeah, I think so too. I think one of the things I think a lot about, and I would just sort of put this in everyone's head, is that this, like the ability of the community to drive and offer input is essential. I think also though we've failed to give the community the tools they need to understand beyond their just personal level what's happening. And so I think about this a lot of like, how do we actually build the infrastructure so that it's not just people's lived experiences, which matters enormously. It's also that they have access to the kind of information that will tell them the choices that their governments are making or not making. And that we really like more like, in addition to listening, that we actually really empower people with like the kind of tools and information that they need to make a difference. Because I feel like I'm 100% with you. And then I look at how little information we've given out, how little insight we give to people into how things actually work, particularly around law enforcement, because we say it's secret. To be honest, like so much can go out. Obviously, the individual facts of a case are not going to be made public, but at an aggregated level, what police do, what prosecutors do, there's so much information that can be made public. What choices even governments make in terms of how they fund addiction and mental health versus law enforcement. All of that, I think, has to be a lot more transparent so that people can come in and both give their lived experiences and actually be able to say, and we see the choice you've made and we disagree with it, and here's why. And sometimes even, frankly, when you see the data, it's so obvious that the choices are wrong. But I agree completely. And I want to sort of send it back to you for questions or comments. Like I've been monopolizing Adam and TOSIN with questions because I have so many, but I turn to you as our host.
But isn't it nice to be at a tech conference where the middle-aged white dude doesn't speak? Adam, can you tell us about handing thousands of dollars to a cop?
Yeah. All of this, you know, like I think about my life in these moments, and really this moment that I think about is the one where I end up on this call with you folks and are having these conversations, and I get to be here when I just as easily could have been somewhere else, and you guys never would have wanted to hear from me or have seen me, because when I was 19 years old, I was selling marijuana at the time, and I was selling a lot of it. I was picking it up and bossing it and driving it back to my college campus in Pennsylvania, and wasn't doing it because I was somebody who was trying to put food on the table for my family or because I had a bunch of bills. I was doing it because I wanted to be cool on campus. And I say that because we like much of our criminal justice system is around young people, particularly young men, making dumb decisions, and that I was one of them. But what happened to me, which is different from other people, is when I was arrested with $6,000 in cash, like little, rolled up bundles of cash, a little bag that had a little bit of marijuana left over in it, and postage scales that I used to weigh the bags out with. And in that moment, it was 1999. It was the end of, but still the fiery engine of the war on drugs. And for most people who look like me, getting caught in that situation, you were looking at, in the best case scenario, a guilty conviction as a drug dealer, and in the worst case scenario, a federal indictment and prison. But I didn't, and as a result, I got to go and do all of these things. I've sat with 3 presidents. I've started a company. I've sold a book. I get to be here with you people, and I don't say that to brag about all the accomplishments that I've had. I say that so that people understand that this moment determined whether or not that would happen, or whether I would be part of this system, of the criminal justice system. And that was because the police officer who arrested me in my driveway. He was a white person, and he was the aforementioned man that flew down to a different country to pick his son out of the orphanage. My dad arrested me and took me down to the station, and he sat me in the cell to teach me a lesson, and he took me home. And it wasn't like the arrest and the sitting in the cell that turned my life around and made me snap out of it. It was the fact that he took me home, and he gave me shelter, and he loved me, and he talked to me about what I had done, and he continued to love me every time I screwed up. And ultimately, the thing that snapped me out of that risk-taking, stupid behavior was age and opportunity and privilege. And that moment, it happens for so many young people that we do not get to enjoy the fruit of their amazing and brilliance, because at some point in time, one person or 2 people made a decision about what was going to happen to that person for the rest of their lives. And that is why this conversation around decision-making, data, where the power sits, and this reform effort is so important.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you so much, Tosin and Anne, for being here. I know we're going to hear from folks who wanted more venture and less criminal justice. And frankly, if criminal justice wasn't so freaking broken, we would do that. But really appreciate and applaud the work that that the three of you are doing, and appreciate you being willing to share it with all of us, and really appreciative that we still have somewhere in the low triple digits of people who have hung in there for now 2 hours of this discussion, and really look forward to continuing the conversation. Adam, if we want to support your organization, which we will be doing, what's the best way to do that?
Go right to the website, prosecuteimpact.com. There's a link on there. And I appreciate the question and opportunity. We definitely need the help. I know that Anne and I are working on some things. So if people showed up disappointed that you didn't hear more about venture, please understand that everything we're actually talking about requires investment, requires building. And there are smart people who are trying to take lessons from both sectors and build a brighter future. So thank you, Ed, so much for allowing me to be in this space with you and my friends.
It is a privilege to get to talk to all of you, and look forward to continuing the conversation. We will send something out to encourage people if they want to get more involved or get more info or support. So thank you, everyone. We've got another one of these coming up next month, and be safe and do good things.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Great to be together.
Likewise.